Dr. Kerry Goettlich has joined me today to talk about his book chapter titled Surveying in British North America, a homology of property and territory, in which he explains not only the relationship between mapping and empire building, but warns us of the unintended consequences of a practice so ubiquitous as mapmaking. He does so through the example of surveying in the English settler colonies. But before we delve into this very interesting topic, I would like to ask you to tell me a bit more about your own background and how it is you came to write for a book centered around the theme of connectivity. Do tell.
Right. Well, the project I'm working on right now is on the history of territory, basically. And so in some ways, it's bound up very much with the history of cartography. And so basically it's through cartography that the connection sort of developed through conversations with Felipe dos Reis and Luis Lobo-Guerrero. The group sort of came together over this problem of the relationship of mapping and empire. Yeah.
Understood. And have you written about the subject before then? Was it your field of specialty, or you kind of fell into this topic? How did that happen?
You mean the topic of which of these topics you mean?
So kind of the overarching theme of connectivity and how it relates to mapping, how mapping allows connectivity and disconnectivity.
Okay, I mean, like I say, the project that I'm working on is on borders, and the way that this connection sort of developed was primarily about the history of cartography. I mean, the way that connection sort of happened was, for me at least, if you're asking about my trajectory, I guess that started when I read Jordan Branch's book, The Cartographic State, and he kind of makes this argument that modern territoriality is actually a sort of a product of cartography in a certain sense. That if you can map something, or to put it a different way, you can't have a kind of modern state territory unless you can map it. Mm-hmm. And that it's kind of because people started creating all these maps with clearly bounded territories and proportional representation and all this stuff, and kind of starting in around the 16th century, that it then became possible to make a state that actually looked like the things that were on those maps. Mm-hmm. And so part of my work is in response to that. And so my work has been more looking at kind of the concrete practices of surveying than the mapping. And what I found looking at especially the American colonies, which is one of the examples that he looks at. Actually, a lot of these boundaries were not really mapped in the beginning. Mm-hmm. So the mapping sort of comes out of the surveying. So in a certain sense, it's the more material practice that's kind of, in a sense, comes first. And then you develop representations about it that kind of make it possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does actually. And it's good you mentioned also how mapping is a rather new practice that has helped establish state boundaries, because I wanted to ask you about these unintended consequences of mapping, which you emphasize. And you mentioned how even for some empire, it could have negative consequences. You give examples of the Holy Roman Empire and the Hanseatic League. And I was just curious if you could just delve into this a little bit more, how mapping essentially discredited their existence, as opposed to a lot of mapping and empire building going hand in hand in other parts of the world.
Okay, so I think what you're referring to about like the Hanseatic League, that's an argument that Jordan Branch mostly makes. And so the argument there is there are a lot of these I mean, there are a lot of different sorts of political institutions in Europe that couldn't really be mapped in the same way that a state could. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire kind of had boundaries in a certain sense, but the Hanseatic League was just completely all over the place. So you couldn't, it just, I mean, what he's trying to say is that it just became sort of normalized that if you had political power, it would be over something that you could draw on a map. So if you couldn't, what he's trying to say is that if you couldn't draw it on a map, eventually it kind of, that became, not necessarily, all overnight. They didn't just disappear overnight. They didn't just decide, they weren't thinking about things in that way. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was just something that became normalized over many centuries. And so his argument is that there's a cartographic element to that. Now, what I'm looking at in this book chapter is a slightly different mode of argumentation that's a little bit more kind of material, if you like. It's less of an appeal to kind of a constructivist kind of idea of changing norms over time. So what I'm trying to say about the way in which surveying kind of limited the ways in which the English colonies at least developed is because in a certain sense, it gave them quite a lot of power. So it's not, I'm not trying to argue that overall it was a strategically bad idea. What I'm doing is kind of pointing out some less recognized downsides, which is that if you basically, the English colonies in America, at least to a greater extent than anything I know of before that, kind of staked a lot of their power on the reliability of surveying practices, so that you've handed out territories or properties, right? And we can get to the connection between those two, based on their ability to be surveyed in the landscape, rather than as you might have had in Europe, and to a great extent also the way that the Spanish did things in America, was you had kind of recognized geographical reference, that people kind of knew where the boundaries were already.
Such as landmarks, rivers, etc.
Well, yes. So potentially rivers, but also, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, if you look at the European treaties, and I've done way too much of this, is you find a lot of things that we would now consider very incredibly vague. Mm-hmm. Just like names of places. And also this is also how it worked between empires, in even in North America, until basically the American War of Independence. So for example, Acadia, which is now Nova Scotia, was kind of passed around in treaties. Or Louisiana is an even better example because it's so big. So when the United States took over, bought Louisiana, they claimed that meant all the way from what's now Louisiana to Oregon, basically, mm-hmm. because it was not defined. It was just Louisiana. Mm-hmm. But what was going on in between the 13 colonies is that they were trying to rely on very precisely defined, surveyed boundaries, mm-hmm. to kind of get away from these kinds of vagueness, but also because they were imposing a new geography on what they sort of treated as a blank slate. So anyway, to come back to your question, if you rely on these surveying techniques, you kind of stake the stability of the entire colony or empire, what have you, on that, then if someone wants to resist, they can attack the surveyors, or when the surveyors are incredibly amateur, as many of them were, and they do shoddy work, because it's hard work, and there weren't a lot of professionals available, then the system can suffer breakdowns, as it frequently did.
So these are a few things that stood out to me as well about surveying as a job, as a practice. You mentioned at some point it was comparable in social status to medical and legal professions. It became this kind of sought after job that carried significant social capital with it, and some big names, founding fathers, were surveyors, at least in their spare time. And then, of course, you also mentioned how, due to surveying practices, there were a lot fewer conflicts and disputes within the colonies about property and where to draw the lines. However, conflicts between the colonies persisted. So how dangerous a job was surveying actually?
Dangerous. I mean, I have heard, that there are some, I can't remember off the top of my head. I do know that there were some stories of surveyors actually getting sick and dying in the process of doing surveys. I think probably the biggest danger would be from resistance. I mean, depending on where you are. I mean, if you go quite far into the frontier, you put yourself at risk from, I mean, mainly we're thinking about Native Americans, but also, I mean, particularly sort of Maryland, Pennsylvania, was a kind of hotbed of conflict. This particular kind of conflict that was not, it wasn't like a declared war. It was to call it a war is maybe a little bit of an overstatement. But certainly a lot of kind of instability and uncertainty, and at times violence between settlers who claimed to represent either Maryland or Pennsylvania. So they would try to arrest each other. Occasionally they would kill each other. So in a context like that, in kind of Maryland, Pennsylvania boundary in kind of the early mid 18th century, to do a survey, either of property or potentially of colonial territory, was a kind of political act. Like if you're doing a survey and claiming that this land has been allocated by Maryland, then the Pennsylvania people might just come in and destroy everything. I wouldn't say overall, I mean, we're making pretty big I'm covering a pretty big expanse of territory over a long period of time. So I don't know if I want to make a big generalization about how this was a really dangerous profession, but certainly at one time or another, it was quite dangerous.
Which does lead me to one more question about surveying as a practice, which is, I found that this is a fascinating example of Native American resistance to colonization through participating in surveying. And I think it was even about the Mason-Dixon line, I think it is, between Pennsylvania and Maryland. At some point you mentioned how they wanted to essentially draw the line indefinitely into the West. And then at some point the Native American tribe, the Iroquois, was like, well, from here on we can't guarantee your safety, and that's kind of where they stopped also drawing the line from there on, because it became too dangerous. And I thought, did any more of this kind of resistance happen through participating in mapping in the settler colonies, or was it a kind of one-off situation?
Well, I mean, that's a fairly prominent example. I mean, the Mason-Dixon line was in kind of engineering history is quite a big event, because you had an astronomer coming over from England to do this. That most of the colonial boundaries were not done in this kind of you might say, flamboyant way of like, you know, everything up to date. So that I don't know of any examples like that, but I do know that there's one historian who claims that it was actually quite a common kind of technique of resistance for the Delawares to kill settlers with surveying implements as a statement, you know, in order to kind of terrorize the settlers, and to make a statement about, you know, so it was quite clear that surveying, the technology of surveying was seen as an instrument of settler power, and that was kind of a kind of dramatic way of resisting.
Fascinating. Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting example. I wanted to talk about one more part of your chapter. It's a concept, really. It's a key concept in your chapter, which is that of homology. Can you explain it a little bit more, and particularly how you used it to highlight the connection between property boundaries and intercolonial boundaries?
Yeah, so a homology is like an analogy, if I can make an analogy about analogies. But an analogy is just saying something is like something else. But a homology is saying that there's, you're not just comparing two things, you're actually making a statement about how they're connected. Either historically or even how they're kind of co-constitutive in a sense. That's basically all I mean by it. But to be more specific about this connection between property and territory, the claim that I want to make, and this is something that I'm making in the project I'm working on, is that the reason really why the 13 colonies ended up using more or less modern territoriality in a quite innovative way, innovative in a retrospective way. They weren't claiming to be revolutionary, but the reason for this was essentially because that was what they were used to in terms of dividing up property. That became, surveying property just became so integral to society and politics in a way that's kind of difficult to imagine from our perspective, because we have professionals now to take care of this. At that time, they didn't really have a kind of easily identifiable professional group to rely on. Many property owners had to do this themselves. It just became so integral to the system that when colonies started to have territorial disputes, it just ended up being the same thing. And it also ended up being pretty much the same thing in the sense that usually what the disputes between colonies were about was property. So the right to distribute property. Or in some cases, interestingly, they started from literally property disputes between individuals or groups of individuals. And in order to survey those, in order to do a survey to solve that dispute, then you have to involve the colonial governments as well, because that is the colonial boundary. So homology here just means, in a certain kind of sense, they sort of became the same thing in a certain historically situated way.
Understood. I think you've made your point clear. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut us off here due to time constraints, but I think this will inspire people to read your book chapter, no doubt. So, Dr. Goettlich, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully until next time.
Great, thanks. Great to speak with you.
Absolutely.